I was your student at Lesley University, and I think that that's really the context that we know each other best, and it's evolved into this collaborative project that you helped us start. And within that context, and because that's how I know you, I'm wondering if there's anything that you could add to that about who you are and what you stand for. And then specifically in terms of today, like who are you today and who are you representing?
So what do you mean by representing? That's a fascinating question.
That's a good point. I guess it's in the context of our collaboration, and I feel like we're therapists, and usually I don't think either of us necessarily have an agenda. When we're asking people to describe.
I always have an agenda. The only difference between I try to out my agendas whenever I can, and the reason why I asked you that question is because I wanted to make sure that whatever I said was consistent with your agenda for asking the question, as opposed to my agenda for how I might answer it. But because I believe that I always have an agenda, and my best case scenario is to do my best to make sure the people that I'm conversing with know what it is, because there's always something underlying what I'm doing, and so is that useful?
Yes, yeah, and within that context, like so my goal today is to understand kind of the ideas of narrative therapy a little bit better, especially in the context of having a global shared experience, kind of, on a even maybe a greater level of the great events of the 20th century, like the JFK assassination or 9/11, because those were American to a certain extent, and this is worldwide. So my agenda is sort of understanding those ideas better, and then also, creating a way to share that in conjunction with the platform that you've created. And that's one agenda. And then the second, I guess, is, since I've talked to a couple other people about this same topic, is I'm wondering how your perspective is going to contrast with theirs.
Yeah, that'll be interesting, because you're the only one who can kind of interpret their perspective.
For now.
But I can certainly. Understanding narrative therapy in the context of what's going on right now, is that a thing that I could talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to describe a little about yourself first, though?
Okay, sure. So I am somebody who has been wound up about social justice since as far back as I can remember. And my dad was an American Baptist minister, and he was, as far as my understanding of his work, it was always in community churches, which was really great for me, because what it did was it moved his work away from a specific kind of theology and into a community context. For example, one of the things I remember about him was when he took the youth group downtown Mystic, Connecticut, to have a peace march, and he was doing that in the 60s, 70s, and so that was the kind of thing. So the youth group was the thing that was doing things. The youth group was not a thing that sat around talking about the Bible. Not that that's a bad thing, but what I really appreciated about what he did was it was about action, and it was about whatever ideas are behind what you're doing. You're gonna move those ideas from the context of talking about them into some form of response. And so as I went through my career, I was constantly sort of thinking about, so this is the context we're in, this is what we're doing here. What can we do to improve this? What can we do to change this? Sometimes what can we do to make what we're doing more consistent with what our espoused kind of mission statement is? And I actually worked through the transition from mission statement to vision statement. I'm not even really sure what that meant, but I do remember when that happened. And I think my experiences was that it was an attempt to kind of move from a this is a mission statement, and ultimately we don't do anything consistent with this. So let's do a vision statement, and maybe we'll do something consistent with that. But always coming back to this idea of, this is great that we're doing this, and whether it was working with folks who had learning differences, or folks who were struggling with substance use, or folks who were hospitalized for a variety of different things, or people who were living marginally. And it was always about, this is the system, this is how it works, what can we do to make this so it has the effect that we're trying to make it have, apparently. I mean, if we're working with people who are living marginally, who might be described as homeless, what is this for? Are we trying to make sure everybody has housing? And so asking those questions to try to continually kind of move it from a context of, we'll have shelters where people can stay and be safe and have that be in perpetuity, or are we going to actually do something about this larger issue? And so in the course of all that came along narrative therapy, and my first exposure to it was completely accidental. And I know you know this story, but I was in my doctoral program at Antioch. I was supposed to take some kind of weekend workshop. I think it was a Jungian dream analysis thing. Don't even really remember. It was to get the credits that I needed. I couldn't go because something happened, and the only thing that I could attend was a narrative therapy weekend workshop. And Bill Lax did a reauthoring conversation with me, which if you want to look up reauthoring conversations, you can. I don't want to spend time here talking about that. And it blew me away, and then when he said, well, that's essentially what the therapy is like, I was like, all right, so this is actually what I've been looking for the whole time I've been looking. And then I think it was like a week later, I actually met Michael White, and that's a whole other story. But the sequence of events that transpired for me in terms of my going from having no idea what narrative therapy was to being completely immersed in it with one of the guys who originated the work, what happened in like a 2-week period where he's literally in a car next to me in a parking lot. I mean, it was so, and then talking to more and more people, getting into the community, finding out, talking to people who knew about these ideas and were working with these ideas, and then learning more and more about it. And I just continued to get more and more wound up about the ideas. And then that all culminates with what my experience was kind of Michael White's focus before he passed was the absent but implicit, and so that's really a center focus for me right now, especially right now, because I believe that if we can do essentially what you're doing right now, but increase the number of folks that we're doing this with, and have conversations that richly describe what's absent but implicit in people's actions, we can undermine the violence, and we can undermine the trajectory that's happened in the past, where ultimately there's been great effort and great attempts, and things have been achieved, but we've gotten stuck in certain places. And so to get past that stuckness is what I think what I want to do with the work now, and what I want to do with the International Narrative Action Collab. Did that answer your question?
It does, yeah. And I think it gets to where you're sort of coming from, and kind of what I know about kind of how you are in your community. And you talked a lot about kind of systemic stuff, and getting at what is intended by our systems, and what is this for. And then you just said, to get past stuckness. And I guess in the context of a vision statement and getting past stuckness, now, I guess I'm wondering what your position is on getting past our current stuckness, and what you see as what do you mean by stuckness? And maybe it's a now versus then stuckness perspective.
What do you mean?
Are we still, in me, it's making me think of are we still stuck in that place where we were, when you started your work, and sort of got exposed to narrative therapy and realized, holy shit, this is me. This is what I want to kind of spread and do. and then going out into the world to practice and seeing all the dysfunctional systems, and then maybe how that resonates with your experience as a kid with your dad kind of starting to take action. So are we still at that same point of stuckness in your perspective? And if we are or aren't, like, how is that translated into the current stuckness of being, kind of stuck at home, and now re-evolving and re-entering the world?
That's wild. Wow, these are, there's so many great questions in there. I guess so. So I guess I'll just go to kind of what's percolating for me. So one of the things that I've witnessed over time is that there's been a tremendous amount of movement, and that one of the things, I mean, literally, so the response that we've seen has been tremendous, and I think, historic and unusual, and not what we're used to. Everybody who knows me is going to take pause at what I'm about to say, because I've been so anti even the word social media, and continually saying it's not social, people, this is not social media, it's a website, blah 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 blah. But actually now saying these platforms that we have access to through Twitter and Facebook and Tumblr and Instagram and all these things are a fabulous and extremely important way for us to communicate information very quickly. Now, it can be misinformation. However, the abundance of direct information that we can get about events is profound. And so that's changed the way that's changed what's possible. And so I wouldn't say that we are stuck like in the ways that we've been in the past. My experience is, and one of the things that I so appreciate about narrative work, and one of the things that I want to promote with our group and this collab, is the notion of thin descriptions, because it's thin descriptions. And just to kind of illustrate for folks who don't know what they are, thin descriptions are descriptions that are like, you take a picture, you make an assumption about what's going on there, and you go on from there. And that's a thin description. There's some accuracy to it, but I like to say that it's like describing a car as a thing with four wheels. Totally accurate. A car is a thing with four wheels. But if you go out into the parking lot when there used to be cars in parking lots, and you're trying to identify your car as a thing with four wheels, you're going to be out there for a long time. A rich description is to describe the car completely, and even to describe it in the context of, when you bought the car and how you bought the car and who helped you buy the car, and what does it say about you that you bought that car? What does it say about you that you stand for? You bought that car. So these, what does it say about you and what does it say about what you stand for, are the kinds of questions that you're very familiar with, but that you also recognize as questions that are intended to bring forth this absent but implicit and richly describe these absent but implicit ideas. So you can see that if you think about, and unfortunately, one of the things that gets us stuck is that not only do we label others as, well, that's a that and that's a that, but we also label ourselves in that way. We're invited to those kind of labeling practices by this culture to say, well, I'm, and then unfortunately, many times it's things like, I'm a jerk and I'm a loser and I can't get anything done and I'm depressed and I'm around. And those thin descriptions are obviously, or can potentially be destructive, not necessarily, but they're certainly not thick descriptions. And if you think about the difference between a thin description of, I'm a car, the thing with four wheels, or I'm a car and this is the color and this is the model and this is where it was built and these are the folks who built it and this is why they built it this way and those are the folks who designed it, and that you would carry around a rich description of who you are in that context, that kinds of changes things. And so in this specific context, when violent acts are happening, for us to be able to take a moment to talk to everyone about why. So you start with, and there's actually, so part of the collab, I should take that back. The why question, we modified that why question in a way that I thought was really fabulous. And to say something like, what is it about this action that makes it the action that you're taking? Because because the why question can become an interrogation kind of question. Doesn't read the way that we're intending it to read, but the idea about, what is it about this action that makes it the action that you're taking? You can just hear from that language how that creates a completely different position. That if you, so that, I'm thinking about this image of these two people. They both happen to be black,
Mhm.
One has a mask on, and the other one is clearly a cop or a police officer with his riot gear on. What would happen if they were to stop and sit
Mhm.
down and each were to ask each other that question, and then after that question, the other questions that we take up,
Mhm.
so what is it about this action what does this action say about what you're standing for? And what does this action say about what matters to you? And how did you come to think about this action as an action that you might take? It.
Mhm.
So you see the answers to those questions move us away from, okay, so let's go back to screaming at each other, because ultimately we're starting to illuminate things that have nothing to do and do not any longer require the violence, because
Mhm.
in my experience of asking people these questions, the answers start to become unifying answers, where we are then so in that richer place, there's places where we gather and where we connect, and this the tradition of this, from my experience, and my experience is limited.
Mhm.
As I learn more and more from people who have way more experience with this work, I find out that this might not even be one of the best examples, but it is one that springs to mind. The Public Conversations Project in Cambridge, Massachusetts,
Mhm.
was approached by people who would describe themselves as right to life folks and people who would describe themselves as pro-choice folks,
Mhm.
back when those folks were having interactions that were violent and deadly. And they approached the Public Conversations Project in secret, asking them for help because they
Mhm.
didn't know how to stop the violence. And the Public Conversation Project took up these questions. And by taking up these questions with these two groups, were able to find a common ground
Mhm.
where they were able to kind of connect, and where the violence was no longer necessary. And so it's an example of what I would hope we would be able to do now, because I don't believe we're a divided country. I believe we're a divided country at the surface level. I don't believe
Mhm.
we're a divided country at the level of rich description, because I've just had too many experiences with too many people where that's not been the case. I mean, like, for example, a woman
Mhm.
who I met with who would have described herself as a pro-life person. And I'm so grateful for my access and my knowledge about these questions, because I was
Mhm.
able to not immediately react to her, but actually ask her some questions, and was able to find out that her primary motivation for doing the work that she did had
Mhm.
nothing to do with the idea that abortion was murder. It had mostly to do with the idea, with her experience of seeing what happened to young women
Mhm.
after they'd had abortions. Now, her perspective was skewed in a certain way, and you didn't have the opportunity to talk about this as much as I would have liked to. But for me to get to a place where it's like, oh, right. So your experience is that after having abortions, women carry around this tremendous guilt, and they carry around the shame, and that then that's actually what you're trying to stand up against,
Mhm.
because it completely transformed what I would have thought up to that point. And so, and that wasn't even a particularly rich description. It was just a couple of questions below the surface,
Mhm.
where there was already huge possibilities for connection with us.
What do you mean by shame in your perspective now? How does that translate into your current experience with people?
Um, well, so I'm really glad you brought that up, because in fact that the shame guilt that shame guilt sort of place in that conversation
Mhm.
creates a tremendous amount of possibilities for further questions. Because I would have, had I had the opportunity, I would have said, my experience is that shame and guilt comes from sort of
Mhm.
a third party evaluative place, where it's like we're being asked to reflect on our actions from a context that's not necessarily of our choice and of our making,
Mhm.
and to ask questions into that place. So, where would you say sort of those ideas come from in terms of your evaluation of this thing that you've done?
Mhm.
Um, and again, so that can be transformed, because the greatest, the biggest kahuna here, the
Mhm.
big kahuna for me, is that there are 7.5 billion people on the planet right now. And in order for us to have the kind of world that we can have, each one of those perspectives needs to be honored. And so thin descriptions don't allow for that, and rich descriptions do. and to ask people questions into this idea of shame and guilt, so that I understand, or I have a complete. I don't believe I can ever understand somebody else's experience because it's not my experience. But for me, for at the very least, for that person to have a richer description of the basis of those ideas, I think is what makes things possible for us to walk around. We talk about how thin descriptions are like postage stamp size, and rich descriptions are billboard size. To walk around at least with a richly described understanding of where these notions of shame and guilt come from in your life, and the position in which they place you, and a variety of different questions that we don't really have time to get into now, but to be repositioned in relation to that, so that we can make different determinations about what ideas we prefer to take up about ourselves, and be in a different kind of position that at least acknowledges sort of that third party evaluative thing that kind of walks around and says, you're this and you should do that, and why aren't you doing that? Does that answer your question?
It does, and it makes me think back to your example of the two people, the cop and the guy in the mask. Well, both in masks, and how ideally we would ask them to kind of reevaluate their position and perspective of each other and their experience of each other. And it also makes me think of I've seen pictures of like cops kneeling kind of to be in solidarity with protesters, and I wonder how shame and kind of third party shame, how it plays into your perception of those events.
So it's really important. I really appreciate that question, but since I'm not any of those people, I don't know. And one of the things that I'm very much committed to right now in terms of my own response to this is to step away from, because ultimately this third party evaluation thing is in many ways sort of informed by what I would do if I was making determinations about what that meant. It creates, this whole so if there's a picture of you on the interweb and you go, I bet somebody's looking at that picture and evaluating me. Well, you're probably right. We're invited to do this. We're invited to look at things and make snap decisions and snap determinations and snap evaluations one way or the other. And what I'm very much interested in right now is declining that invitation and staying open to possibilities, and saying, I'd really love to interview those folks and find out. I mean, I'd love to interview the two people in that picture if I had the opportunity, only because I believe there's a tremendous amount of power there. I mean, their willingness to be in that position in the first place says something. I don't know what it says, but it says something. I'd love to know what that is. And so if I want to look at an image that strikes me as powerful, I can talk about why it's powerful for me, but I can't talk about what it meant for the people in the image. And it's, I think about that as this, to have an awareness of how we're invited into that position also, I think, it's certainly important for me. And that, I come back to this all the time because ultimately the value of these ideas is about their value for me. I don't know if they're value for anybody else. I know they're valuable for me. And so that's why I continue to move forward with them, because I can't know somebody else's experience. I can't know it's going to be useful for somebody else.
So you addressed the importance of being able to ask questions of these people to kind of better know, well, not to know, but to better understand their values and in relation to themselves.
What you're doing is fabulous, because if that was an effect that these kinds of conversations had, where because there's an editing of ourselves that I believe is completely unhelpful. An editing that says, am I saying the right thing? Because that takes us to this, that's a response to to this third party evaluation thing. But when you're there, at least what were you doing when you were doing that dance around those words?
I was trying to figure out what that stuff meant to me, I guess, trying to understand how my perception of this stuff might influence people that I'm talking to without me realizing it. And then also wondering if this was a good time to start to go into the idea of privilege and where we're both coming from. Like, you know, I'm a white guy, I grew up middle class, and that's where my perspective and my context comes from.
Yeah, and again, you know, in the context of thin descriptions, we could take that as a thing that makes us similar, but you know, we have no idea. We don't know what those words mean. But the very thing that you're doing in the context of what you just did, by kind of outing that whole trajectory is something that I think is fabulous about this work, because it didn't undermine you in any way to do that. It just brings some clarity, and so you moved yourself from this place of kind of trying to do this thing that was in your head to put it out there. That's why the whole thinking out loud, I think, is a wonderful thing, because why wouldn't you, unless you take up this position of so what part of my career coming to this place, I worked as a consultant in a major Harvard teaching hospital, and was trained very specifically that my job was to be the expert, and my job was to go up there and tell people what to do. And it's a very thin position to be in. It's a very thin idea, and it keeps my position in relation to what's going on very much masked. Speaking of masks, and not unclear. And it was not about collaboration and cooperation. And so I've had experience of working from that position, and it was extremely stress inducing. And I went home multiple nights and cried for hours and hours and hours, because ultimately that's what was really going on for me. But I was supposed to mask that in the context of the work. And so in many ways, this is a counter proposal to that idea that we can be open and direct about what we're thinking. We can disclose what we're walking through with the questions that we're asking and the responses that we're giving. And my hope is that in some ways, to do a little segue into the privilege idea, that can undermine this notion of privilege, because at least in my experience, much of what's required. So another huge thing that happened to me when I was working with people who I describe as living marginally. They're generally described as homeless people. The reason why I kind of moved away from that label is because in the work that I was doing in the area that I realized the vast majority of people who I was interacting with on a daily basis, as they were not living in homes, were actually from that area. They thought about the area that we were sitting in as their home. It wasn't my home, it was their home. They'd been there, they'd grown up there, gone to high school there. And so the idea of living marginally kind of repositions them in terms of that label as to the margins of sort of the culture that we kind of understand as people living in homes and going to grocery stores. They were living on the margins of that. And it was this whole juxtaposition of, you know, who's marginal and who's not, and what is transience, and is transience, you know, moving from place to place or job to job, because you know, that's what I was doing. But these are the homeless people, you know, sort of those labels were thin descriptions and didn't make a lot of sense. And the richer descriptions then lead us to this area of complexity. But in the context of privilege, you know, there's a lot about, okay, so this is what I was talking about in terms of masking things. In order for the thing that struck me about that work was that there was this I experienced in the people who were not living marginally a kind of a desire. And again, I wasn't steeped in this language as much as I was then, as much as I am now. So I didn't have the opportunity to talk to folks. But there was sort of this need to kind of distance ourselves from folks who are living that way. And I was always fascinated by that, because I was like, you know, you may actually know these people from high school, or these folks have been living here longer than you, but the idea that creating that distance sort of creates some kind of safety for us is sort of an invitation that we can take up, that comes from our culture, that the best way for us to maintain some sort of anything is for us to create distance. And in a lot of ways, this notion of privilege is kind of embedded in that. And so a privileged position requires that I not disclose a privileged position. Like, for example, if I'm going to be an expert in a room, me expressing my expert opinion is rooted in some sort of assumption about why you should believe me in the first place. And that's not generally rooted in me saying who I am or why or where or how long I've been doing this. It's just about, well, in a lot of instances, me saying I'm a doctor, and I am a doctor. But the most important thing I learned from that work was being able to say, I don't understand anything. The freedom to actually be able to talk about what I don't know is what came to me from that. But it creates privilege when I walk into a room. Hi, I'm Dr. Glenn-Wixson. That creates a certain position. And so what I appreciate about this work is that my talking about why I'm going to ask the questions that I'm asking and where it comes from and what my agenda is an attempt to undermine that privilege. So rather than saying, I'm gonna this question without, a question comes out of my mouth and the person I'm asking it to just, because of who I am, assumes that it's a great question. What I'd rather have, or that they're supposed to answer it and that there's some value in their answer. What I'd rather have is for them to have a clear understanding of why I'm asking in the first place, how it's rooted in my own agenda and experience, that agenda and experience may have nothing to do with their agenda for being in the room. And then they can make a determination about whether or not the question has value or whether they want to answer it in the first place. And so in that way, my hope is that this work undermines that power position as much as possible. Like, it can't be done away with. And ultimately, a person who I'm working with who's in a group that's marginalized, whether it's socioeconomically or gender-wise or orientation-wise or race-wise or whatever it happens to be, they walk out of the room and they still have that, they're carrying that with them. I walk out of the room, I'm still a white guy. And so in the context of how the culture evaluates me, my undermining my power in that conversation doesn't necessarily have any real effects for them long term, but at least it's a way for me to participate in conversations that's an attempt to undermine those assumptive kind of power positions.
Like, how have you noticed your blind spots emerging when you think about your relationships, like all relationships, not just personal, in the past few months, but professional and personal? How do you recognize, and how have you recognized those blind spots, and maybe what are they, if you feel comfortable talking about them?
Oh yeah, they come up all the time. I mean, one of the things, so the first one that came up was, oh my gosh, people who are in abusive relationships are now locked inside with their abusers. Didn't see that coming. And people who are marginalized in the first place, who are just barely starting to have a voice, no longer have a voice because they're now closed in their homes. Didn't see that coming. The idea that those are powerful, relevant things in people's lives on a daily basis. And my wife talked about, she has a friend who lives in Manhattan and can see from her view people who are living in what might be described as projects, and who are, where she's in her air-conditioned condo with one person. They're in their air-conditioned apartments with 5 or 6 people, and because previously that life was perhaps somewhat tolerable because they didn't have to be in there all the time. Now they're in there all the time. It's the idea of the things that I never thought of before just keeps unfolding and unfolding and unfolding, and it's profound. The specific, I talk about in this context what happened with Katrina, where people who had been marginalized by our culture manifest when everyone who could left. And everyone who was left there because they didn't have the option to leave like other folks did, and they ended up in that in the Coliseum or some arena without toilet paper and without reasonable sanitation or supplies. But that's sort of what we're seeing now, except in a far larger scale. And these are things that it's very easy for me, who live in a cabin in the woods in Maine, who can go outside and potter around for a while without ever seeing anybody, can easily not be connected to. And so yeah, blind spots, not even, and also, people who I've met in the collab who don't identify with the cis pronouns, who I continually mispronoun, even in the context of talking about how I'm mispronouncing somebody, I'm mispronouncing them again. How the gender pronouns are something that are so much a part of my experience of being able to look at somebody, evaluate them in terms of gender, and then use a pronoun that makes sense to me, and having to divert that in the context of somebody else's experience is a blind spot that's coming up over and over and over again. But it turns me back to this notion of on purpose, where people who don't fit into the assigned categories in the context of really anything are then in a position to redetermine that determination on purpose and become whatever it is that they're connected to in a way that's consistent with their intentions. Whereas, it's like in the context of gender, where I've been cis male as long as I can remember, my orientation towards being male is something that I wasn't a part of. I've just kind of taken up different roles as I've rolled along. Whereas somebody who at a different stage in their life has an experience that has them in a position of asking to be identified in with a pronoun that's not necessarily consistent with how they've been identified before, is then evolving that position on purpose. And we can do that in a variety of different contexts, and perhaps, right now, how to, or being whatever we're gravitating towards right now on purpose, whether it's somebody who wants to stand with folks who are struggling, whether it's somebody who wants to stand for specific ideas of freedom, whether it's somebody who wants to stand with a certain group of in a union kind of context. The ideas that made sense about that 3 months ago, the context for that really doesn't exist anymore. And so we have the opportunity now to kind of construct a way of being on purpose. And even, it's one of the things that's striking about this very situation. You mentioned folks in masks at protests. This is the protest environment, the context of the protest. As I'm talking to people who are talking about going to the protests, I'm like throwing out ideas about safety and social distancing and wearing masks. I mean, where the context even for the protest is completely different now than it was before, and we can take that up. We've been indoctrinated in this notion of fear of the unknown. We're supposed to, but everything's unknown now. We can take up a fear position in relation to it, or we can take up a position of, so how are we going to do it now, and what is it that we are going to do now? I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, and it really strikes in me, or really sits in me, like the position of what do we want to do now, and it brings me back to what you said, like, are we being pulled now in a different way to stand for freedom? And my idea of freedom, I guess metaphorically, is riding really fast on a bicycle down a hill and just feeling the sky and the wind and the plants and that kind of thing. So I guess, that's sort of my image of freedom, I guess. And I don't know if that image has changed in terms of a new position now. So I get, whereas I think about like the kind of the idea of what do we want now as maybe a separate question. And sort of, I guess what I want is I want to keep being in a position to take a walk every day and to see my family a lot, because I'm indoors with them, and to talk with my friends more because I'm on Zoom all the time now. So I guess I'm wondering those two things about your experience, and you might be frozen. So I guess, what do you mean by freedom, and then what do you mean by the new position?
The question that comes up for me is this question that I've thrown out before, and it's the in order to achieve what question. And when I'm asking myself, or people are asking me what we should do, I'm thinking about the in order to achieve what question, because, for so many years, I've had conversations with folks where they say, I don't know what to do. And that's where that question evolved from, because ultimately, I don't know what to do is in this sort of vast sort of undescribed place of who knows what, but when you attach to that in order to achieve what, then we can kind of go, oh. And so if the answer to the in order to achieve what question is to have a culture where I can be able to go for a walk every day, then the question can be asked, so how might you ensure that that culture continues to exist? And what's a part of that culture that allows that to be true? And is that a culture that you want to make sure is shared with everyone? Would you want it to be a culture where everybody feels comfortable going for a walk every day? And if that's a culture that you want, what could you do to contribute to the possibility that that actually is available and true for everyone? And there's this little side thing to the in order to achieve what question that's about making sure that the answer is within your control. So when people would ask, they come in with a child who has problems with alcohol, and they would say, I don't know what to do. And I'd say, in order to achieve what? And they'd say, in order to get my son to stop drinking. And I'd be like, there's nothing you can do to get your son to stop drinking. And so so it repositions that question in a place of, if I'm the answer to the or to achieve what question is something that's outside of my control, then the reason why I feel frustrated is because I'm trying to control something I can't control. But if I can modify that answer, why is it important to you that you would want your son to stop drinking? Well, because I love him and I don't want him to die. Okay. Well, so, and, we can talk about where that love came from and what it says about what you stand for, what matters to you, so that thinly described, I love my son, becomes a billboard-sized description, and then that's a thing that the person would carry forward. It also might inform their actions in terms of the things that they can control. But coming back to, the idea of freedom is you being able to go for a walk every day. Is there something that's in your control that can continue to make that a possibility? Or is simply talking about that as your idea of freedom something that's important to you? Because you can certainly do that. You can speak those words. You can speak those words in whatever form you want to speak those words into. I really appreciate that notion of freedom. It speaks to me as where did that idea of freedom come from for you?
I think for me, that was the first thing like I did as an adult. It was like the first hobby I really found as an adult that was on my own. And I realized that within our social context of sports being very important and not being like, a baseball guy or a football guy, I could be sporty in a way that I guess resonated with me in that social context. So I guess it improved my identity, and maybe even increased my privilege to a certain extent. But so it allowed me to modify my identity in a positive way that felt good at that time. And then also made me feel physically good and also exhilarated and excited, not just because I found it, but also because in doing it, it was just really exciting.
And you can, I know we're running out of time, but you can, in what you just said, there's a million questions that could be asked into those territories in terms of your context of the sportiness and the context of your taking this thing up as something that you could do and the effect that it had on you physically and the fact that it made you feel better. I mean, there's a million different questions that could be asked into those territories that would establish this huge, rich description of this relationship between that notion of freedom for you. And that would be something that you could carry around in the context of why this is something that you want to make possible, continue to make possible for yourself. And that it may be something that you would stand for in a way that's more important than other things in your life that you might not have a connection to in the way that you have the connection to this. And so even conversations about freedom that we might have with people, because I really, so that strikes me, this notion of freedom being about your ability to go out for a walk every day, because it gets me thinking about a completely different way of thinking about freedom than I would have thought of before. The idea of freedom being, my ability to kind of walk out my back door and go around and pick edible plants and eat them for breakfast, which is what I did today. That's something that, because of what you said, it has me cherishing that in a different way. It has me recognizing that really as a kind of a manifestation of freedom that I have that other people might not have. And so because of what you said, I'm repositioned in relation to even ideas about freedom that I carry around that I never even thought about before. One of the things that I cherish most dearly is the idea of curiosity. And having two kids had a profound effect on that for me, because I got to see them come into the world with curiosity that was beyond imagining. Shoving everything that they came across in their mouth to see what it felt like in their mouth. Now, I mean, that's like profound curiosity. And our work with our kids was to do our best to kind of maintain that curiosity, because it's something that's not necessarily cherished by the larger culture. And good, bad, or indifferent, our intention was to try to support that as much as we could. And it's from my experience, it's one of the most important parts of narrative work, is to come from a position of genuine curiosity when we ask people whatever question we ask them. And so if I could put out something to the larger community to that I'm going to continue to do my best to stay in that position of curiosity, regardless of what I see, or regardless of what assumptions I'm going to be invited to make about what I'm seeing, to hang on to that position of curiosity, because there's always something going on there that I don't know about. And there's always a piece to this story that I don't understand. And if I can stay in that position of curiosity, I can at least become a bit closer to that possible connection around that limited understanding, where we can become unified, because this is a time where we need to unify as an entire country, not as small subgroups, but as an entire country, to come together to express and share our shared suffering, and to understand where it's rooted in, because the roots of that suffering, I believe, is far more common than we have yet been able to understand. We want to undermine what the massive media tends to do, just because of the format, to give us thin descriptions that undermine our curiosity, and to keep coming back to this position of curiosity, the idea of, what was it about that action that made sense to you? What was it about that action that made sense to you? In a position of, I really want to know the answer to that question. And that through that position of curiosity, we can create a fundamental way of being that's very different than what we're used to, that will allow us to come together and be a species that recognizes, understands, and cherishes our differences, but doesn't see those differences as problems and dangerous. So I guess to get back to your first question, something about who I am. I'm somebody who's striving for that. That's who I am.